you all for joining us this morning on our high school pathways that predict post-secondary success. We're so glad to see you here. We expect a few more people to join this morning. We are also recording this session so that others who were not able to be here this morning can see it and you can share with friends and colleagues. On behalf of the E3 Alliance, I'd like to introduce our team, go over the agenda, and then get us straight into the presentation this morning. So I am Susan Dawson, President and Executive Director of E3 Alliance. I'll just be kicking us off today. We'll have 3 members of our research team sharing some of the findings around pathways to post-secondary success. Harrison Hopp is going to start us off, followed by Rodrigo Lopez, both of whom work on our research team. And Dr. Andrea Jacks will be wrapping up the end and closing the work. We're also going to have some commentary on our specialist in this arena, Kyle Seip, who is our post-secondary success coordinator. So on behalf of these, plus all of the behind the scenes people in our communications and other parts of the E3 Alliance team, we'd like to both thank you for being here and welcome you here today. Our agenda is pretty packed. We have just an hour. You'll see a very short introduction, but then an introduction to the actual work on pathways to prosperity. This work has been going on for close to a year, and we actually had a precursor set of work to this research that came out 3 or 4 years ago that many of you may be familiar with. And then we're going to talk about the specific analysis we're sharing today around a cohort of students, the achievements that they have seen and the pathways that they're taking that can either predict success or barriers to success and later on in their pathways beyond high school. It's a pretty packed agenda, as I said, just an hour. And so we'll have 2 opportunities for you to be able to provide input. We hope that you will use that special Q&A button at the bottom of your screen in order to present questions to us that we will try to manage and share answers to during this session if it's possible, or we will certainly save and follow up with those questions, and it will allow others to comment on people's questions. But if you have just general ahas, takeaways, the observations, please put those in a chat and we will capture those also. So observations in the chat, questions to the presenters into the Q&A. So E3 Alliance is all about transforming education systems, not individual programs or classrooms, but systems through data and collaboration so all students can succeed. And so key to this mission is not just understanding and assessing and sharing data, but making that data useful and actual and actionable so that you, our partners, can work with us to drive change. So how does this work? It's of course much, much more complex than this, but essentially we start with the data, accessing data from across the state, individual students, and use that data to work with practitioners, to work with those who have the experience that we are trying to help address and to live in the system every day, to turn that into knowledge that we can then use to change policy, practice, change systems that we are using that so often hinder students to drive action to instead help those students. And one particular area that this research is really applied to is those transitions into post-secondary, whether that's a 4-year degree, a 2-year degree, or an industry credential with value in the marketplace, so that can lead to greater success in terms of living wage jobs and opportunities for success in students' future lives. Unfortunately, as most of you know by now, our enrollment in any post-secondary programs and systems has been consistently dropping in our region, in our state, across the country for the last 10 years. And this was especially impacted during COVID. And why do we care about that? Well, one simple statistic is that only 12% in our region of young adults in Central Texas who don't have a certification, credential, 2-year or 4-year degrees within 6 years of leaving high school are going to have a living wage. Just 12% of students without that credential will earn a living wage 6 years after high school. We actually have tattoos, you might have seen them, and stickers that you can help us get this word out, because this is so important that we, as a collective, take responsibility for changing our systems so that every student can have a pathway to success beyond high school. So that's what it's all about today. And now we're going to move to Harrison to share some of the research about our pathways to prosperity and jumpstarting the conversation here. I do want to let you know that this is just the first of many conversations that we have scheduled throughout the summer and fall, where we'll be coming back to you with other nuances on this data set and with answers to questions that you might have. For instance, today we'll be showing you Central Texas data, but we do have data for the state and other regions within the state, and we will be sharing that on our website and in some of these additional sessions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Harrison.
Thanks so much, Susan, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you all. And yeah, as Susan mentioned, I'm a research analyst here at E3 Alliance, and I, alongside my colleagues, am going to be walking you through this Pathways to Prosperity data research that we have to share with you all. So without further ado, like most research projects, ours started with a question, and that question was, does taking dual credit for career and technical education courses, receiving industry-based certifications, and or participating in early college high school make a high school graduate more likely to either enroll in post-secondary education, not enroll and make $15 an hour or more, or not enroll and make less than $15 an hour? And one defining term I want to clarify here, when you see, for today at least, the word post-secondary, we're referring to either a 2 or a 4-year college option. And so what was the process for trying to answer that research question? Well, for starters, we needed to identify what cohort of students we would be looking at. Of course, we needed to look at high school graduates, but from what year? And would we hone in on Central Texas, look at Texas as a whole? And then once we decided on that cohort, looking back at those students' achievements, their 4 years of high school, and seeing what their engagement was like in regards to dual credit, CTE, early college, and IBCs. And then lastly, examining the pathways, finding those connections between those achievements and their post-high school graduation outcomes, specifically in regards to post-secondary enrollment and making over or under $15 an hour. So starting with the cohort, we decided to focus on Central Texas High School graduating class of 2020, and specifically those students who attended a Texas high school all 4 years and who graduated on time from a Central Texas high school. And so that amounts to almost 20,000 students, and you can see here their demographic breakout. So approximately 43% were students from low-income families, about half female, about 8% of students qualifying as receiving special education supports, and 8% qualifying as English learners. And then below you have the racial breakout: 6% Asian, 7% Black, 43% Hispanic, and 40% white. So now you know about our cohort, and like I mentioned before, the next step in the process was to look back at their high school experience. What did that 4-year engagement look like in regards to our specific domains that we were interested in? And so some fast facts for you about those domains. So again, specifically honing in on that cohort of about 20,000 students, we saw that over 17,000 students, or approximately 88%, took at least one CTE course. Over 4,900 students, or about a quarter of the cohort, took at least one dual credit course. Over 2,000 of those students, or about 10%, received at least one industry-based certification. And over 700 students, or 4%, participated in an early college high school program. And so those are just the fast facts, but we of course wanted to take a deeper dive into each of these components. And for that, I'm gonna hand you off to Rodrigo Lopez, who's gonna talk you through it.
Thank you, Harrison. Happy to have everyone here today. So before we get to the actual data points, I'll go over some important policy changes related to dual credit. So first one here is section 28.009 from the Texas Education Code from 2006. So this required all school districts to implement a program by fall of 2008, where students could earn up to 12 hours of college credit in high school. Then we have House Bill 505 from 2014. This prevented the limiting of the number of dual credit courses or hours where a high school student may enroll each academic year beginning in the 2015-2016 school year. And it also repeals statutory language that limited the number of dual credit courses a student could enroll in at a college that's outside of their high school's service area. In addition to that, some other policy implications to consider here. So mainly the cost of dual credit courses. So depending on the region, geography across the state, the cost of community college dual credit courses taken in high school varies significantly. As an example, in the ACC service area here in Central Texas, students that are in the taxing district pay only the cost of textbooks, whereas students that are in the service area but outside that district have to pay textbook and tuition costs. And then lastly here, we'll give you the definition of dual credit. So according to the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, they define dual credit as a system in which an eligible high school student enrolls in college courses and receives credit for those courses from both the college and the high school. So with those definitions set, we'll go into our actual data points. In this first one here, we're looking at high school graduating classes over time. So you'll see on the bottom 2013 to 2020, and we're looking at their dual credit engagement. And so what we mean by engagement is how many of these students are taking one or more credit hours of dual credit. And here we're looking at Central Texas compared to Texas overall. So you'll see Texas is that purple line. And we see two things when we go from 2013 on the left to 2020 on the right. This dual credit engagement has been increasing for both Central Texas and Texas overall, and Central Texas has been consistently below Texas overall in terms of that engagement percentage. So focusing in on Central Texas and looking at, for those students that are engaging with dual credit, how many credit hours are they actually taking? And so you'll see here, there's quite a bit, but you'll see it's same cohorts. So 2013 through 2020 on the bottom. And we've broken out the credit hours into 4 groups. So 1 to 6 credit hours, 7 to 12, 13 to 18, and then greater than 18 credit hours. So main thing I want to highlight here is from 2013 to 2020, those top 2 bars, those will be students taking 13 or more credit hours. You can see that that has grown a lot from 2013 to 2020. It's still small, but it is growing. You can see 4% and 6% here on the left for 2013. And then if you go to the right for 2020, that has increased to 13% and 14% of the cohort. So zooming back out a little to overall engagement as well for Central Texas, this time breaking out this data by race ethnicity. So you'll see here, the left set of bars, that's for 2013. That's that rightmost endpoint from the previous data point. The right side of bars is 2020. And so we see 2 things here. One, the engagement rate, so that's that top bar segment for each group, has increased for all groups. But you'll see that the disparities here from 2013 on the left to 2020 on the right have grown as well. And then as an example, to give you reference of size, if we look at this Hispanic bar for 2013, that cohort size is about 5,600 students, so 5,600 Hispanic students. Jump to 2020 on the right, that has increased to 8,400 students. So 11% of 5,600 to 22% of 8,400 Hispanic students are engaging with dual credit from 2013 to 2020. So we've gone through some data points. So real quickly, we'll give you some thinking time to think through this question on your own. So do the trends in dual credit engagement align with your experience or understanding? And we'll give you about 30 seconds to think through that.
And once again, this is a good time to capture your reflections in chat that you might want to share, or if you have Q&A for the audience, please hit that Q&A. I mean, for the presenters, please hit that Q&A button.
All right, thank you for taking some time to think through that. Jumping from dual credit, we'll next be transitioning over to career and technical education, or CTE. Before we get to the data points, I'll give you some quick definitions. The first one here is career and technical education cluster, or CTE cluster for short. So these are 14 TEA-defined groupings of CTE courses. Secondly, we have our CTE levels of engagement. These are an E3 Alliance definition. We have 4 categories here. The non-CTE, these are students completing 0 to 2 semesters in CTE. Now you might be wondering, non-CTE, but we're accounting up to 2 semesters in CTE. Now the reason that is because traditionally there were some courses that were designated as CTE, but that were not tied to a particular pathway. So moving on from non-CTE, we have the CTE Explorer. These are students completing 3 to 4 semesters in CTE. Then the CTE Concentrator. These students complete 5 or more semesters in CTE, but fewer than 5 semesters in any given cluster. And then the Occupational Concentrator. These students complete 5 or more semesters in a single cluster. So to give you kind of a lay of the land, so to speak, for our first data point, we'll have here the 14 clusters, and then we've arranged them based on how frequently students are taking courses in each of these clusters. So you can see arts, AV Tech, and communication is the most popular here, and by quite a bit, next to the next most popular, health science. And then this is for 2020 high school graduates. And a couple of things I wanted to point out is education. So we all know how important education is, but if you look at this data point, you'll see education on the right side is the 10th most frequently taken CTE cluster. Another point I want to highlight here is STEM. So STEM is also quite important, and we see here it is the 6th most popular taken CTE course or cluster. So moving on to our levels of engagement here. So we're looking from 2012 to 2020 down at the bottom. And then I've highlighted some policy areas here. For 2012 and 2013, you'll see that students that are graduating fully under 4x4. Then on the right, you'll see 2018, 19, and 20. Those are students, cohorts that are graduating fully under House Bill 5. And in between those, you'll see a transition period from 4x4 to House Bill 5, where a student could graduate under House Bill 5 if they wanted to, but they were not required to. So here we're looking at our 4 levels of engagement. And the main thing I want to highlight from 2012 to 2020, you'll see is that large growth in the percent of each cohort that is at that occupational concentrator level. So remember, these are the students that are taking deep dives into CTE, 5 or more semesters in a single cluster. We'll see 2012, that's 16% of the cohort. To 2020, that is now 38% of the cohort. So we'll focus in on those 2 endpoints for this next data point. 2012 is those set of bars on the left, 2020, those bars on the right, and we'll break this data out by household income. So on the left side, 2012, we see there is a small difference between our students from low-income households and non-low-income households that are at that occupational concentrator level, 15% for non-low income, 19% for low income. When we move from 2012 to 2020 on the right, we see two things. One, that occupational concentrator percentage has grown for both groups up to 38%. And then we can see that that percentage is now equal for both groups, 38% for non-low income, 38% for low income. So our students really are taking a lot more CTE, and they are taking those deep dives into CTE, which we can see here because that occupational concentrator percentage has grown for both groups. All right, thank you for stepping through that CTE data with me. Next, I will hand it off to Kyle Sipe, and he will talk through some data to action with us.
Awesome. Thank you, Rodrigo. Just to kind of recap for everybody too, as you're thinking through what you've seen thus far, you saw the cohort, you saw some of their performance indicators thus far. And then as you're looking at that cohort, you saw that dual credit engagement and really dual credit dosage continues to increase over time. When you looked at the CTE and specifically CTE dosage started to increase over time, and look at the impact that HB5 had in that renaissance, if you will, of packaging up those CTE clusters. And then in the same breath, that loosening, if you will, of the HB5 and then the dual credit partnerships that started to expand, where we're looking at more students, or we should say more courses being taken, which begs the obvious question then as we get into that HB3 outcome bonus conversation is the who. When you look at your student populations and we start looking at the students that we are seeking, do the disparities that we've continued to see still factor in? And I saw it in the chat come out that you see that across income levels, there's still inequities there. And getting into that conversation of, is it the same students taking more, or are we going and seeking those students? And really, that's the data to action that I want you to see today. As you're looking through that first section and kind of getting into the achievements that Harrison's about to show us, think about who in the building is participating in those courses, and specifically how we go and seek those students who are traditionally underrepresented and getting them into these experiences. Harrison, take it away.
Thanks so much, Kyle. So yeah, as Kyle had mentioned, I'm going to piggyback off of what Rodrigo just walked you through. He, generally speaking, looked at data describing dual credit and CTE engagement over time. Now I want to take a closer look at that engagement, but also show you those connections we found between the engagement and post-high school graduation outcomes. So starting by honing in on dual credit, and specifically, we want to hone in on core dual credit course taking by subject. In reading this chart, you'll see that top row shows cohort, which actually is the demographic breakout of the group that I had described earlier. It's those almost 20,000 Central Texas high school graduates, and it's those same demographics we had gone over earlier. That's there for you just as a reference to benchmark the other data against. The next row shows the group of students who took at least one dual credit course, and then the demographics that correspond with that group. The row below is very similar. The slight difference is that this is the group of students who took at least one core dual credit group. You'll notice that these two rows are very similar, and there is a lot of overlap in that group. We define core dual credit as a high school core course that maps over to a college core course. And then the next set of rows describes the groups of students who took at least one core dual credit course in a given subject. And then the last row is 13 plus hours, which describes the group of students who took 13 or more core dual credit hours, regardless of subject. And I want to point out that we considered adding in another row for students taking 7+ hours, but the trends were so similar there. So just something to keep in mind as well. I want to show you how to sort of digest this data. And for that, let's choose this math row as an example to hone in on. So in that first column, you can see that almost 1,500 students out of our cohort took at least one core math dual credit course. And of those students, about 31% were students from low-income families. That also means the inverse is true. So about 69% of students were students from non-low-income families. And then moving over to the next column, we see that of that group of students, about 57% were female. Again, the inverse of that means that 43% of those students taking at least one core dual credit math class were male. And then you have in the subsequent 4 columns, the racial breakout of that group of students. You might be wondering what's going on with this whole blue gold shading. And so for that, take a look at the bottom left-hand corner of the slide. So blue, as it says, corresponds with a disproportionately high representation. So in this example, we see our Asian students were disproportionately high represented in this group, whereas the gold shows disproportionately low representation, and that applied to our low-income group and to our Black students, specifically in this example. And so now that you can get a feel for this chart, I want to give you all about 20 seconds to take it in and see what trends stick out to you. All righty, so let's walk through this together and do it column by column, noticing the patterns that pop out. Starting with this low income column. So as we see with the any dual credit, the any core dual credit, and even that bottom 13+ hour row, we see that generally speaking, there's a lower representation of students from low income families when it comes to core dual credit course taking. And that's actually something we see at the state level too. And then we also see that core dual credit subject areas either have a disproportionately large portion of students from low income families, like with fine arts, science, and Spanish, or disproportionately small portion of students from low income families, like what we see with ELA, math, and social studies. And with the exceptions of fine arts and Spanish, we actually don't see these trends at the state level. Things are more proportionate. And even with fine arts and Spanish, things aren't as drastic at the state level as what we see here at the Central Texas level. And then moving on to that gender column, we see with all subject areas course taking, things are disproportionately female. And that's something we see at the state level too, that skew towards female representation. And then with this racial breakout, we see large variation by race when it comes to each subject area. Ton of patterns there, so I'll give you a moment to identify what sticks out to you. Okay. Moving on to the next domain that we wanted to look into, CTE, and specifically focusing on, as it says at the top, occupational concentrators, which, as Rodrigo had mentioned earlier, is defined by students who took 5 or more semesters in a given CTE cluster. And so this chart you see here, very similar in format to what we had just been exploring with core dual credit. But I do want to call out, of course, you see some asterisks, which did not show up in the previous chart. Those are there because of FERPA regulations. And as you see at the asterisk at the bottom of the slide, it's due to small cell size. So we're not able to show those figures, but that's what that means. And then again, want to point out that first row is just that cohort row. So it's there as a benchmark for you to reference as you compare the subsequent clusters. So let's start by analyzing the data here with the low income column. And what we see when it comes to income status makeup, there's a smattering of under, over proportionate representation by CTE cluster. And so starting with that high representation, we see architecture and construction, hospitality, human services, law and public service, and transportation clusters in highly represented with students from low-income families.
Wait, Harrison, I think you said that backwards. Is that correct? Okay, so these are where there's high representation are the blues and then low representation are the golds, correct?
Yes, correct.
Sorry, I misunderstood that. Thank you.
No worries. And with the exception of architecture and construction, we see these same trends, that high representation at the state level too. And then, yeah, Susan, on the flip side, here now with business and STEM, we're looking now at disproportionately low representation of students from low-income families. And this is actually not the case at the state level when it comes to business. And we do see low representation for STEM at the state level, but not nearly as drastic as what we see here. And then moving on to our gender column, we also see sort of a mix. And let's hone in on first where we see high representation of female students. It's these three clusters: education, health science, and human services. And this is actually something we see at the state level for all three of these clusters. And then again, looking at the flip side of things, these 7 clusters that I've highlighted are where we see underrepresentation of female students. And with all of these clusters, we see that same trend at the state level. And then similar to dual credit, there's just a huge variation by race when it comes to CTE cluster. And so I'll give you a moment to digest this. There are so many patterns to pick out. So I'll give you some time to look through it on your own. Okay. Now moving on to the last domain that we wanted to take a deep dive into, and that's with IBCs. And so again, you're seeing a very similarly formatted chart. That first row is our cohort, same statistics there as a reference for you. The next row underneath, it says any IBC. So that row shows the group of students who received an IBC in any category. And then the subsequent rows show the student groups of those who received an IBC in a given cluster. And actually at the top left, you see it says CTE cluster. It's actually not a typo. The way IBCs are categorized is actually in line with the CTE clusters. And so, yeah, that's just the way it's categorized. But let's go through the trends the way we did with the other charts together. So starting with this low income column, we again see a mix of high, low, some proportionate representation. But overall with IBCs, looking at that any IBC row, we see, generally speaking, a low representation of students from low-income families receiving IBCs. That's actually hugely different from the state level, where that's not the case. We see things as more proportionate there. And then focusing specifically on where we see high representation of students from low-income families, we see education and transportation, both of which we see at the state level too. And then on the other side, we see arts and AV, business, health science, manufacturing. We actually don't see this at the state level. There's higher representation of students from low-income families at the state level for these clusters. And then moving on to our gender column, we see by that any IBC row, slight overall underrepresentation of female students when it comes to IBCs, which is also something seen at the state level. And then huge variation by cluster. And so let's hone in on those, starting with the low representation of female students in these 4 specific clusters, with as low as 7% with transportation. And then on the high representation of female students, we see these 3 clusters: agriculture, education, and health science. And health science being our highest at 81%. And then again, huge variation, like with dual credit, like with CTE, when it comes to race by cluster. And so I'll give you a moment to look through that. Okay. So that's a lot to take in, and want to pause and give you all some thinking time. And so, question for you all to consider: what do you think might be driving disproportionalities in these achievements? So take 30 seconds to think through that. All righty, thanks for taking the time to do that. I want to sort of step back and revisit this process that we talked about before. You know about our cohort. We've now looked back at their 4 years of high school and specifically honing in on that engagement with dual credit, CTE, and IBCs. And now we want to focus on those pathways, finding the connections between their accomplishments in high school and their post-high school graduation outcomes, and specifically pertaining to enrolling in post-secondary and making over or under $15 an hour. So I want to talk through the process for how we went about doing that. Instead of looking at correlation, we did what's called data mining, which means that we know the outcomes of these students, whether or not they enrolled, whether or not they made over or under $15 an hour. And so knowing these outcomes, we run analyses that isolate what connection, if any, each accomplishment had on a student belonging to that outcome group. And we do that while controlling for demographic information. And so we weren't necessarily trying to get at the why behind something leading to more students being in one group or another, but rather our goal was to find where the strong connections existed. And so the first pathway we want to look at is with the predictors for post-secondary. And what do we mean by that? Let's use the first example we see here. So in that CTE cluster category, we see health science occupational concentrator. So what this means is that after controlling for demographics, a student being a health science occupational concentrator, again, which means taking 5 or more semesters in health science CTE classes, those students were more likely to enroll in post-secondary than those who didn't. In other words, our system is set up in such a way that the achievements on the right-hand side have a significantly positive connection to a student enrolling in post-secondary. And it's tough to quantify exactly the connection each predictor has. We can't label it with, X percentage sort of thing. But we do know that all of these achievements you're seeing are positive predictors of post-secondary enrollment, just of varying degrees of strength. And so within each category, predictors are listed in order from starting with the strongest to still strong, but not as strong as you go on in that category. So it's a lot of information there. I'll give you a moment to digest that. I want to call out, there's a lot of STEM focused predictors we're seeing here. Some of you all might be familiar with, for example, our math pathways work. And so that was something we were encouraged to see there. Also, last on the list, we see something we haven't really talked much about yet, but participating in an early college high school program. And that's going to show up later on as well. The one thing I also want to caveat this information with is don't assume that the first predictor in one category is necessarily on par with the first predictor in another category. And so to that end, we sort of wanted to give you that top 5 ranking list of, well, what are the strongest predictors? And so we need to do that in 2 separate categories. The first category we call the top yes or no predictors. So using the first predictor as an example, yes or no, did a student receive the nurse aid assistant IBC? Yes or no, did a student take 13 or more hours of dual credit classes? And so these are the top 5 predictors for post-secondary enrollment that we saw on those category of variables. Yes or no, did a student achieve this or not? And then the other category of predictors we generated this top 5 list for was what we're calling our +1 predictors. So for this +1 category, we're talking about what is the impact of, for example, taking one additional core dual credit fine arts class. And so among those variables of testing what is the impact of doing one more of that thing, these came out as the strongest predictors for post-secondary enrollment. And I want to give one big caveat here with this type of predictor is that while the data shows that these have the biggest impact, we recognize it might not make sense for a student to take, for example, an additional core dual credit fine arts class. Things work on a case-by-case basis. Maybe there's course requirements interfering with certain things. Maybe there's course limitations and availability that doesn't permit things. And so this isn't necessarily a recommendation for take as many fine arts classes as possible. The next pathway we want to look into is protective factors from earning less than $15 an hour. And so again, I want to go through an example with you. Let's use what we're seeing on the right-hand side. The first example is in that dual credit category, we see taking 13+ core dual credit hours. So using that as an example, we see that the system is set up in such a way that students who took 13 plus hours of core dual credit were less likely to end up making less than $15 an hour than those who didn't. And again, that's after controlling for demographics. So as you see, there's a huge presence of dual credit for this pathway. We also see, as I mentioned before, early college, high school program participation showing up here. We see STEM, the importance of STEM in that third row. And then the fourth and fifth are actually individual courses. They're both CTE and dual credit courses. The level 4 is a descriptor of being that it is a CTE course. The farther along you go in that CTE cluster, the more advanced and level 4 is a descriptor of how advanced that course is. And so, yeah, taking these individual courses we found were protective factors from earning less than $15 an hour. And then lastly, we wanted to look into the predictors for earning less than $15 an hour. And so again, I want to take you through an example that shows what exactly this means. And let's use this first transportation CTE occupational concentrator as the example. And again, sorry, forgive my broken recordness, but once and again, the system is set up in such a way that students who took transportation 5 or more semesters of those CTE classes were more likely to end up making less than $15 an hour than those who didn't. And again, that's after controlling for demographics. And so the achievements you're seeing here on the right-hand side have a significant connection to a student making less than $15 an hour. And one thing I want to point out is, with the exception of that agriculture IBC category you see there, all of these hold true at the state level. We see the same thing. And so, again, that's a lot of information to take in, and to help digest that, I want to turn to Kyle, who's going to talk you through turning that data into action.
Thank you, Harrison. And I want to recognize too, I know we're closing through and we just went through some very heavy data, heavy charts, and I know you're all interested to distill that down on your own. I think one of the things that we talked through, going through the achievements for the groups, and we looked at the students who were participating. And I think we need to, get the empty chair at the table and say the students that were not participating, especially when we looked at the occupational concentrators and then the dosages of dual credit. And then more importantly, when we got into the predictors and the protectors, in that same breath, dosage mattered. And talking about dosage matters, disparities still existed. And I think through that lens, when we talk about really our low income students, especially in participation in dual credit and some of the CTE occupational concentrators, where they have that opportunity to really put the jacket on and see how this career might fit, how it might, propel me forward. And I know it came through in the chat a couple of times. These numbers are scary, and really calling out that action there in Susan's opening remark. Remember that tracking towards a post-secondary credential, that it was students that don't track towards that post-secondary credential have that 12% chance of earning that living wage. And I think that's really that call to action is getting students into these programs, into these opportunities, but then ushering that transition service as well, and thinking about how we can find really the synergy here is fit and alignment. I've said it time and again, and those of you that know me, kids don't take courses, they take teachers. And so we see on the high school side, where we see the power of a teacher, the power of an educator, and the power of a lighthouse bringing students into these opportunities. And that holds true on the higher ed side as well, in that transition where we're handing off students to teacher, lighthouse to lighthouse, and really putting our students in places to be successful. As a former math educator, I'd be remiss if I didn't say math matters. And I know that Harrison brought that up in that math pathway and scary math pipeline that we talked about before, and really looking at the disparities that existed about getting our students from low income families, our Black students, our Hispanic students, and get them the opportunities in these advanced pathways in math, but also for that dosage that we talked about with the indicators, the dosage of dual credit, the dosage and opportunity as an occupational concentrator. And that's a great segue over to AJ to close out some of the next conversations.
Thank you, Kyle. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So wow, this was just so much research and so much hard work. And I really thank Rodrigo and Harrison and Kyle for all the hard work that they do on this, running the data, thinking about the analyses, and then also taking those analyses and translating it into things that are actionable and things that we can actually take to make our education systems better for students. One of the really important things that we saw from this analysis is that students are doing all of these things. They are making all of these achievements and just, blowing it out of the water in high school. But it is our job as those who are interested in education, those who are working with students, those who are school administrators, to make sure that those achievements that they're making in high school that they think will lead them to success in their careers, into their post-secondary journey, actually translate that way. So making sure that they know, here are the courses that are aligned with what you want to do, or, here are some improvements that we can make to our courses to make sure they are really aligned with what is needed in the workforce. And so I think there is so much data and so much research here that every time, even though I have been very much involved in this work, every time I hear these analyses, every time I see this data and research, I have more questions and more thoughts and more ideas about how we can take this research and use it to help improve things for our students and work with our partners on that goal. So my hope is this webinar is recorded. I know we've got some folks who are probably not watching this in real time, but are joining us at some point in the future. But even if you are here in real time, my hope is that you will come back to this webinar and go back to some of those key portions of the webinar where we talk through particularly equity implications of this data and really think about what that means for your work and how we can make things better for all students in Central Texas. We will also be sure that you have the slide deck and that you can engage with us over the summer and into the fall. We have a lot more data that is coming and a lot more that we'll be doing on this project. This is just the first step. So please keep engaging with us. On the next slide, we'll show you some information about how you can follow us and get in touch. But one of the ways that you can help us determine how we are going to conduct these next engagements is to complete our survey. If you go to menti.com, you can enter the code that is on the screen, or you can use your phone or your iPad to take a little picture of that QR code and go straight to the survey and fill it out. While we are talking about going places on the web, there were a lot of questions in the chat about, do you have data on this thing or that thing? And as of right now, there is brand new data up on our website, data.e3alliance.org, on dual credit and career and technical education. So we have that descriptive data. It's a little bit different than the data we presented here. So here we were looking at just high school graduates. There we have data for the full senior year cohort. So you can see how students are doing in Central Texas and in other regions in the state. You can do some comparisons. You can look at Texas. And if you are representing one of our partner districts and you have a login to the portal, you can actually see that data for your own district. So that's really cool as well. And you can do some comparisons with that. And so let's make sure that those websites go into the chat so that everybody can access the links. And there are specific pages where you can look at CTE and dual credit. If you're going to the front page, data.e3alliance.org, make sure you go to the top and click on education profile to see all that great data that you can access, not just the CTE and dual credit data, but there is a lot of data there that you can play around with and interact with. So we hope that you will both take the survey and also take some time to check out our website and play around with some data and have some learnings and hopefully bring us back questions. As Susan mentioned at the beginning, the research we do, we really want it to be a value add and also actionable. We want this to lead to transformational systems change. And we want to use your feedback and your questions and your concerns to develop our research questions so we know they are things that you actually need and will actually use. So please continue to engage with us. You can follow us on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Facebook. A lot of our data that we'll be releasing over the summer will come out via social media. So make sure you like and follow us. But also you feel free to send me emails directly. And there are opportunities to send us feedback on individual data points within the portal at data.e3alliance.org. There's a little light bulb on every data chart. You can click on that and send us feedback through that. And again, the primary source of this data is through the Education Research Center. So that is such a great resource for us. And it allows us to bring you really interesting data that looks at students' outcomes over time. So thank you to the folks at the ERC for working with us and getting us this data. We appreciate it. So thank you all again for attending and keep engaged with us, and you will receive a follow-up email with all sorts of resources from this webinar. Thank you again. Take your 2 minutes back and enjoy your day.